This is Up. I'm David Gura, and we are 11 days away from the first Democratic debate, which will be right here on MSNBC. 20 candidates will square off over 2 nights in Miami on June the 26th and June the 27th. Castro will be in the first debate, along with former Congressman Beto O'Rourke, also of Texas, and Senator Elizabeth Warren. The former HUD secretary, the former mayor of San Antonio, was in Arizona this week for a Fox News town hall, something other Democrats have declined to do. We talked about that event, upcoming debates, and his policy proposals over pastries, of course, at the Fair Trade Cafe in Phoenix. Let's start with the event itself while you're here in Phoenix, in Arizona. Walk us through the calculus of deciding to do this. As you know, there were plenty of other candidates who said, not going to do it on principle, on whatever grounds. Why did you decide to do it?
I'm very progressive. I've shown that when I've been out there on the stump and in the policies that we've rolled out. But I also respect what other people believe. And I know that if we're going to get great things done for the country, it's going to take working with the other side.
Are you sympathetic to those other contenders who have said that they're not going to do these town halls?
Sure.
You understand the argument.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own, way of thinking about these things. I definitely take the concerns about Fox News, and I understand completely how people feel. But what I'm focused on is not the news organization. What I'm focused on are the people out there watching.
Could you have foreseen how many people would be running for the Democratic nomination?
I was telling people, a year ago, that I thought there would be between 12 and 18 people. So this exceeded my wildest expectations even of how many people would run. But, I think that some of the culling of that field is going to happen naturally. I know also with these debates, it's going to be an opportunity for the voters to start sorting out, maybe who they agree with more and who they like more, who they could support. So I'm looking forward to that process.
And how do you do that? I mean, how do you distinguish yourself on that stage?
Well, I think my secret weapon is my charming personality, number one. I'm kidding. I think, like I said before, it's a combination of things. It's how people feel about you as a candidate, but it's also where you stand on the issues. These debates, if anybody has watched, previous debates, they're going to get right into the differences among the candidates on issues, whether it's on the issue of the Hyde Amendment or the issue of immigration or what we would do for rural Americans. People are in a very, short amount of time going to start getting a sense of where all of the candidates fall. And my strategy is, number one, to be myself, because I think people want to know who you are. They don't want to know, or they don't want to think that you're putting on airs or trying to be somebody that you're not. So I'm just going to try and be myself. I'm going to try and, talk to people about what I think is important for them and for their family, and let them know about my experience and track record of actually getting things done. And in the mix of all of that, I'm confident that I'm going to do well.
Former Vice President Joe Biden has said he doesn't want to attack fellow Democrats. Do you take a position like that when you look at what might happen on that stage both of these nights? Is there room for that kind of disagreement? Well,
yeah. I mean, I think always in politics that the voters are making choices, legitimate choices based on what people are going to do for them and for their family and for the country. So if people have issues related to the issues, then yeah, I think that's fair. There's always going to be contrast. But what I hope doesn't happen is personal attacks or some sort of Donald Trump-style attacks. I mean, the people that watched those 2016 debates, what you saw there was, I think, the dumbing down by Donald Trump of the democratic process. And we certainly don't need to emulate that, and I don't think anybody will.
Former Congressman Beto O'Rourke said that Joe Biden would be a return to the past.
You cannot go back to the end of the Obama administration and think that that's good enough. As much of a horror show as Trump has been, we had real problems before Donald Trump became president. We cannot return to the past. We cannot simply be about defeating Donald Trump.
How do you see this moment? You were part of the last administration. You have a progressive agenda. You're looking forward. How do you do both things?
I think what people want is somebody that both understands where we've been as a country and also understands, though, that we are in a different moment and where we need to go. And so apart from all of the back and forth between other candidates, what I'll just say for myself is that I've been out there articulating a strong vision for America's future.
Is age a fair line of attack? You're a young guy. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Bernie Sanders, you have Joe Biden. These are older guys who've been in politics for a very long time. Is that something you think voters should take into account?
Well, I think it's something that voters will take into account. I also think voters will take into account somebody's experience, and oftentimes experience comes with somebody being more up in years. However, the most important thing that somebody should take into account is neither somebody's actual age or their experience, it's their judgment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lex McCammon, I'm going to go to you first. Where does he fit into all of this? He talks about how he's out there trying to make his message known. He's polling at the bottom of all of these candidates. He'll be in the debates, though, so at least he's there. But where does he fit in, and where does that message fit in as somebody who, again, is from the old administration, from the Obama administration, and now has that forward-looking vision that he described?
Well, when I've seen him on the trail, he relies heavily on talking about that executive experience he has to try to sort of set himself apart, not just from President Trump, but from other folks running in the field who don't have as much experience as him. And the interesting thing that comes up all the time when I talk to people is people expressing surprise that someone like Julian Castro, the only Latino in the race in the year 2019, someone with the type of executive experience that he has, and someone who has been rolling out really thoughtful policy proposals.
He's putting out the stuff.
Yes, he's putting out the work, policing reform, immigration, education platforms. People express surprise that he hasn't broken through, given that he's sort of doing all the right things. I don't know whether and how he'll break out at the debates. I think that when you have a minute to give an answer, you have to rely more on making people feel something to have that longer lasting effect with voters rather than saying, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z in a sort of monotonous way.
Ben, your take on that? I mean, you knew him from the Obama administration. Is what we saw there, is Julian Castro?
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.